In the grimdark future of Warhammer 40K, what happens when somebody dies? When a guardsman of the Astra Militarum falls in battle, what happens to their soul? Does it get a happy ending and ascend to a higher state of being alongside the God Emperor, or is the soul condemned to spend an eternity being ripped apart by hungering demons? This is a question that has plagued mankind for tens of thousands of years. The ecclesiarchy says all those who dedicate their lives to the worship of the God Emperor are rewarded with a spot in his celestial army after death. However, other factions like the Eldari, who have been marked by the chaos god Slanesh, claim there is nothing but endless suffering for all of the lost souls sent shrieking into the afterlife. Still, other more science-y types claim that there is nothing beyond the veil, simply the silence of oblivion. But what exactly is the truth? Is it possible that all of these factions are right to one extent or the other? What actually is a soul and how do they work? Unfortunately, this is a question that the lore of 40K normally isn't super clear on. The few times it does seem to actually spell it out for us, it will also immediately contradict itself in another source. Needless to say, this has led to a lot of confusion in the fanbase and everyone having a slightly different interpretation of the text. But what if I was to tell you there was a document most people haven't read that spelled everything out in explicit detail? One that was meant to be passed between the authors behind the scenes at Games Workshop and never released to the public. A document that, of course, ended up leaking onto the internet. In comes a guide to the fictional background of chaos in GW Games by Rick Priestley, one of the founding fathers of 40K. I'll be honest, I had never heard of this particular article until I stumbled upon it by chance while gathering source material to research for this video. And I gotta tell you, it was one of the most extraordinary and insightful pieces of 40K literature that I've ever read. So of course I had to make a video about it, telling you all the juicy insights I found. In this video, we're going to get to the bottom of how a soul is created when a person is born and what happens to it when they die. We're going to talk about each classification of soul and how the afterlife differs for all of them. We're going to talk about how gods and their souls are created, how they grow stronger, and what impact they have on our universe and the Immaterium. We're also going to get into how the Chaos Gods and the Emperor of Mankind are the same, and importantly, the key elements that set them apart. We're going to talk about all that and a whole lot more in this video, as there's a lot to talk about. But before we dive headfirst into the grimdark, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Rocket Money, an easy-to-use all-in-one app that helps you cancel subscriptions, manage your monthly bills, and keep track of your finances. You can use it to make a customized budget in seconds, keep track of where your money is going at all times, and identify top spending categories. It'll even notify you when your balance is low or of upcoming charges as to avoid overdrafts and late fees. You can imagine my surprise when I started using Rocket Money personally, and I found out I had been paying for Xbox Game Pass for like 2 years, even though I only subscribed in the first place to play a single game. I even had an active Nexus Mod Manager subscription from that one time I modded Skyrim and was too lazy to download and install each mod individually. After connecting my bank account to the app, it categorized all of my subscriptions into an easy-to-read list. That way, I was able to keep the ones I wanted and deactivate the ones I didn't. And Rocket Money very well could do the same for you. Rocket Money has already saved its customers over $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving them up to $740 a year when they use all of its features. So if you want to take control of your finances today and join the over 5 million other members that are using Rocket Money to save more and spend less, then go to rocketmoney.com/weshammer or click on the link in the description to get started for free. And you can save even more money by switching to premium. Again, that's rocketmoney.com/weshammer or the link in the description to get started for free. Big thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video. The first thing we need to know in order to understand how souls work in 40K is the difference between the physical universe and the warp, a concept that most of you are probably pretty familiar with, but I still have to briefly cover it for all the newcomers, but I'll make it quick. In 40K, there are two parallel universes that every living creature exists in simultaneously. The Materium, also known as the physical universe, and the Immaterium, also known as the warp or the Sea of Souls. The Materium is a realm of logic, physics, matter, and all things tangible, whereas the Immaterium is a realm of energy, concepts, emotions, and ideas. Our physical bodies exist in the Materium, while our souls exist in the Immaterium. Although it's tempting to think of both of them as two separate places, and in some senses they are, more realistically the two universes are one and the same. They are two sides of the same coin. Likewise, everything that happens in one has a direct effect on the other. Now, although the thoughts, beliefs, and systems of categorizing all things related to the spiritual and supernatural will vary from faction to faction, broadly speaking, we can categorize souls into 5 distinct categories: souls, lost souls, drifting souls, powerful souls, and spirits. So let's talk about each of them, and we'll start with your just run-of-the-mill baseline souls. When a person is born, an invisible tether known as an anchor is formed and cast into the immaterium, where it latches onto a cluster of energy and binds it together. This cluster is what we refer to as a soul, and throughout the entirety of this creature's life, the soul will remain tethered to their body via the anchor. Now, souls are not aware, they're not conscious or even technically alive. They are little more than a coherent lump of raw energy that can be drawn upon and used as a source of power. This can be done consciously by psychers and sorcerers, or unconsciously by individuals with latent psychic abilities. However, one does not need to be able to conjure fireballs out of thin air, utilize telekinesis, or read minds in order to draw upon their soul's power. Every living thing does this at one point in time or another throughout their life, normally in moments of extremity. That spike of adrenaline and heightened awareness we experience when we or a loved one is in danger, that's us briefly tapping into the power source of our souls. Just like how a body decays and breaks down into its constituent parts after death, all of which eventually return to the earth, the same thing happens with a soul. Whereas our bodies are constructed from tangible matter such as water, salt, carbon, sulfur, etc., so too is the soul constructed from intangible matter. Dreams, thoughts, ideas, memories, beliefs, and of course every human emotion are all energy, i.e., components of a soul. After death, the anchor that binds the body to the soul is severed, and with nothing to bind its energy together and nothing to tether it in place, the raw material of the soul is cast adrift amongst the other raw materials of the warp. An untethered soul that has broken apart like this is called a lost soul, and after a soul becomes lost, there's no way to get it back. It'd be like trying to retrieve a single raindrop that has fallen into the ocean. However, every ounce of energy that was originally part of that soul will eventually be recycled and used in the construction of many new souls in the future, just like how the elements and minerals that originally made up our body will one day be used in the creation of another one as well. Now, although it's rare, there are souls that manage to not dissolve in this way and stay fully intact after a creature's death. These fully formed souls that have been cast adrift and are no longer tethered are what we call drifting souls. A drifting soul retains an essence of the most deeply held emotions or thoughts that characterized its owner in life. They still don't have any kind of consciousness of their own, however, and will end up drifting freely through the warp until they meet and coalesce with souls of a similar nature, all of them becoming part of a greater whole. Over time, these masses of spiritual energy will grow stronger and stronger, eventually gaining a personality and sentience of their own. These masses are held together by common emotions and belief. In this way, the emotions and beliefs of all living creatures affect the warp itself. As a person ages and builds up a collection of memories, experiences, and beliefs, their souls will grow stronger and more defined. In the grand scheme of things, most of these souls are not particularly remarkable, but every now and then, an individual will craft what is known as a powerful soul. But this is something that is primarily reserved for full-blown psychers or individuals with latent potential, whether or not they ever become aware of their abilities during their lifetime. Either way, when the owner of a powerful soul dies, their consciousness is transferred intact to their soul, meaning unlike other types of souls, these souls are fully aware whilst they are in the immaterium. A soul that is animated by consciousness is referred to as a spirit. You can think of spirits as fully formed human personalities that only lack a material body. They can act and move within the warp and may lead a spiritual life amongst the other entities that live there. Sometimes a spirit will choose to be reborn in order to live out another cycle within the physical universe. When this happens, they will open themselves up to the anchor being cast by a new baby. This anchor will find purchase on the spirit instead of a random mass of energy, thus the spirit will reincarnate. This new incarnation of the spirit is a whole new person, one who will almost never have any awareness of their past lives or the time they spent within the warp, only learning the full truth of their existence after death, and once again returning to the immaterium. Now, these are some of the strongest souls that exist, growing increasingly powerful with every incarnation. Eventually, they may attempt to communicate and pass on their knowledge through the developing souls of the still living. Sometimes a person who has reincarnated will, for one reason or another, begin to understand the truth behind their soul while still alive. This is a very slow process that can take an entire lifetime, or in reference to particularly old spirits, multiple lifetimes to achieve. This process of increasing awareness is normally accomplished through study, sorcery, religious practices, astral communication with other similar spirits, or the act of spirit walking. Now, spirit walking is the process wherein a psyker casts off their physical shell and transfers their consciousness from their mind into their soul. This causes their physical body to briefly fall into a coma as they reawaken within the immaterium now existing as a spirit does. Now, this is not the same thing as dying. They don't suddenly learn everything about their past lives all at once. But through spirit walking, they may catch small glimpses, flashbacks, untraceable memories, and a sense of some things being important without fully comprehending why. Every time they do this, they may unlock another piece of the puzzle and slowly work their way towards full enlightenment. Although it may not seem like it at first, for the most part, spirit walking is considered relatively safe. The individual is always tethered to their physical body via their anchor, which acts as a lifeline back to the material universe. That being said, there are still risks involved. There are creatures that exist that can detect them and sever their lifeline. Thus, it's a spirit walker's responsibility to never go too deep into uncharted depths and to be able to recognize and defeat these entities should they emerge. Whatever path or process the individual uses to get there, if they manage to become fully awakened to their past lives, this knowledge, as well as their personality, is passed on to all incarnations going forward. Thus, the individual has become effectively immortal. Our primary source here tells us that behind the scenes, such entities were referred to as immortal reincarnates. Now, how a spirit capable of reincarnation goes about initiating the process in the first place is not explicitly explained. It's believed that it can happen in a lot of different ways, sometimes as a deliberate choice on behalf of the spirit, and other times as an unknown natural occurrence. However, sometimes the process can go horribly wrong, and we end up with what is known as fragmentation, in which the reincarnating spirit, which has opened itself up to its next incarnation, instead of having a single anchor latch onto it from a new baby, will have multiple anchors find purchase on it at the same time. Sometimes it may just be 2 or 3, but other times, they could be hit by a couple of dozen anchors all at once. This causes the spirit's consciousness to fracture, as pieces of its personality, memories, power, and identity are all pulled in different directions, thus leaving it in a weakened state. Now, people whose souls are formed from a fragment of a spirit like this will almost never have any memory of their past selves, even if this was something that the spirit had unlocked previously in a different incarnation. It's theoretically possible that these people could repeat the process and learn the truth behind their soul, but if they did, they would only be able to gain knowledge and insight into the portion that was assigned to them. While they're living in blissful ignorance, back in the immaterium, the fragmenting spirit is now unable to defend itself from the ever-constant pull of the chaos gods and other powerful warp entities. We'll talk about them a bit more later, but to grossly oversimplify the soul of a chaos god, it's the same thing as a spirit, just on a much more colossal scale. These giant clusters of energy are continuously attracting drifting souls and other energy aligned with their traits. When a spirit is undergoing fragmentation, it struggles to hold itself together, and thus fight off the ever-present pull of one of the 4 powers. Pieces of the spirit, i.e. bits of memory, belief, or emotion, break free and are drawn toward the associated deity. Slowly over time, the spirit will lose its sense of self, and its consciousness will slowly disappear. Once a spirit becomes divided through fragmentation, it's unlikely that it will ever be whole again. Now, you may be surprised to hear this, but in the grand scheme of the universe, fragmentation like this is actually a relatively new phenomena. The warp may be vast beyond human comprehension, but it's technically not infinite. There's only so much spiritual matter that exists. Under normal circumstances, the energy would be just continuously recycled through the process of life and death. But as each one of the 4 chaos gods grows ever larger, they lock up more of the warp's limited resources. Simultaneously, the ever-ballooning population of species like mankind, whose population is said to be in the quintillions by the time of the 41st millennium, is having a similar detrimental effect. Now, a fragmenting spirit is one thing, but traditionally speaking, regular souls attached to a living person are not inherently at risk from the chaos gods or other malign entities. The process is not fully understood, but something about being anchored to a physical body either conceals the soul or renders it inaccessible. There are, however, a few exceptions to this rule, the biggest one being if the owner of that soul, knowingly or unknowingly, opened himself up to chaos. This is an act that will always draw the ruinous power's attention. The most detrimental way that this can happen is if the person starts actively worshipping the chaos gods, the act of worship itself initiating the process of exchanging pieces of their soul for power. A person doesn't have to be a full-blown heretic, though, to draw the gods' attention. It can happen just by living one's life in a way that aligns with them. In either case, once noticed, these people will be marked by one of the powers, thus increasing their soul's vulnerability. The deeper they go into their heretical practices, the more their soul will be siphoned away and consumed by their patron. When the person eventually dies, their soul will break apart like any other soul. But instead of dispersing back into the raw energy of the warp, it'll be dispersed into and become an indiscernible part of the deity itself, thus increasing the god's overall power. So what exactly is a chaos god then, and how were they originally formed? Now, as I mentioned before, a soul breaks apart into fragments of emotion, thoughts, and ideas after its owner's death. Each of these components then drift unconsciously through the immaterium. What can sometimes happen is little bits of spiritual matter that are similar in nature will randomly bump into each other and get stuck together. These tiny masses will continue to grow larger over time as they keep bumping around and getting stuck to other bits of aligned energy. Now, this process is accelerated if there is an abundance of similar emotions within the sea of souls, and decelerates if such emotions are in short supply. Eventually, these masses will form into a sizable collective. As it grows larger and stronger, its traits are reinforced and become more extreme. At a certain point, the collective may develop a consciousness and a personality of its own. If this occurs, the newly formed entity no longer has to rely on random happenstance to grow bigger and stronger. It can actively begin drawing in this material. After this, it will even gain the ability to suck in fully intact drifting souls that are similar in nature to itself. As its power continues to grow, the entity will be able to begin asserting its will on the physical universe. Now, the Immaterium is absolutely full of sentient blobs of energy like this, and most of them being relatively unimportant and going unnamed. But the four most prominent within the story of 40K, and easily the most powerful, are the Chaos Gods themselves, who feed upon the most prevalent aspects of the galaxy's intelligent species. So souls, spirits, and deities are all essentially the same thing, just to varying degrees of scale, power, and consciousness. However, a trait that is unique to the Chaos Gods is the formation of demons. Now, as each one of them represents an enormous ocean of spiritual power in their own right, they're able to freely break off portions of their raw material and exert their will over them. These little pebbles chipped from the boulder are what we call demons. As the demon is a piece of its master, it gains a personality that mirrors its creator. Now, something that is unique to demons is the ability to possess living people. But due to a person's anchor shielding them from predatory entities, it's actually pretty rare that this will happen. From the demon's perspective in the Immaterium, trying to possess a specific person would be like trying to find a specific grain of sand in a desert. There are, however, a few things that make possession a bit easier for the demon. Number 1, if the soul in question has been marked by the demon's associated god. Number 2, the individual having a particularly strong trait or emotion associated with said god. Or 3, and this is the big one, the person is a psyker. When a person draws upon their soul for power, whether consciously or unconsciously, the soul will briefly flare with a release of energy. That energy then runs down the soul's anchor through the veil between universes and into the psyker's body. If a demon happens to notice this flash and moves in to study it, they can watch the path the energy takes as it travels through the soul's anchor. By traveling alongside it, they can gain entrance into the Materium and into the body of the tethered person. When this happens, the majority of the demon's spirit remains behind in the Immaterium, only a portion going into the possessed person's body. Regardless, after this occurs, it will cast the consciousness of its host out of its body back along the anchor and into the person's own soul for storage. Once a person becomes possessed like this, it is almost impossible to reverse the process. To force their way back in on their own would require a ludicrously powerful will. Now that being said, there are definitely individuals within 40K capable of doing this, like the Exorcist chapter of Space Marines that treats overcoming possession as an initiation rite. But for regular old people that are not on that level or higher, it requires outside help, namely from other powerful spirits within the Immaterium that happen to notice the compromised soul. Okay, so where does the God Emperor come into all of this? Is he the same as a Chaos God, or is he something different? Well, we don't know the full truth about what the Emperor really is, but our primary source here does give us some pretty interesting broad strokes. As far as we can tell, the Emperor has never reincarnated, which is one of the primary ways a soul continues to grow stronger. But that being said, he doesn't really need to do this. The body he was born with is virtually immortal. He's lived for tens of thousands of years, and in all that time, he grew immensely powerful. At this point, his soul is said to be a rival to the Chaos Gods, and just like them, the Emperor can grow stronger by absorbing the souls of other people. However, this is where the whole thing about there being not enough of the Warp's limited resources to go around comes in. The four Chaos Gods have already laid claim to the majority of lost and drifting souls, and most of what's left over is being used to make souls for currently living creatures. This means the only energy of any real worth left for the Emperor's soul to feed on are the remaining souls that are capable of and awaiting reincarnation, namely recently killed Psykers. Since the Emperor is still anchored to a physical body within the material universe, this process of absorption relies on both a Psyker to be sacrificed in order for their reincarnating spirit to be absorbed, and for this sacrifice to occur in close proximity to the Emperor's body. After a Psyker is killed, and before they can reincarnate, their soul is sucked through the Emperor's body or consciousness and transferred along his anchor into his soul within the Immaterium. Now, the whole time he's doing this, he's also siphoning a portion of his soul's power back into his physical body in order to keep it alive, and thus maintain a foothold in the physical universe. This process began after the Emperor was mortally wounded by his son Horus and placed upon the Golden Throne around 11,000 years ago. The lore tells us that ever since then, 1,000 Psykers a day have been sacrificed to him. However, we also know that by the time of the 41st millennia, 1,000 souls a day wasn't considered enough, and that number had increased over time, eventually reaching upwards of 3,000 souls a day. But for the sake of some good old-fashioned quick maths, we're just going to call it 1,000. So 11,000 years times 365 days times 1,000 souls a day equals 4,015,000,000 Psykers that the Emperor has merged with. There's no real way to accurately quantify this into some type of actual power level, but it gives you an idea of just how ridiculous the Emperor has become. When it comes to souls, spirits, deities, and the warp in general, there are still a lot of unanswered questions in the lore of 40K. But hopefully everything that we've covered here today gives you at least some background understanding of its more metaphysical elements. Before wrapping this video up though, we should briefly discuss the particular source most of this information came from. For me personally, I'm the type of person who takes everything that ever appeared in media produced by or for Games Workshop as canon until something else comes out that contradicts or overwrites it. That's always been my policy since day one. But this particular document is a weird one. It was never technically released at all. Additionally, 40K's had almost 4 decades to expand since it was originally written. It's always kind of weird when you reach back to the oldest source books to use for research, because on one hand, you know a lot has changed since those days, but on the other hand, oftentimes Games Workshop will introduce critically important concepts to the lore super early on, and then never talk about them again. Lord knows that was the bane of my existence when I did my Adeptus Mechanicus deep dive, and I spent way too much money on old source books and probably gave my computer at least 6 different viruses from downloading PDFs from shady websites. Anyways, I think this document in particular is best used as a grounding point for understanding concepts that don't get thoroughly explained within the lore, rather than treating it as the lore itself. Honestly, I don't even technically think you can rightfully call it lore. This was an article about the lore, created by one of 40K's most influential figureheads, but still a document that was never meant to see the light of day. It was something meant to be a starting point, a skeletal framework for all of the authors that would contribute to the lore over the next 40 years. All of the ideas, concepts, characters, and events that they wrote about using this document and others like it is the actual lore. That being said, like I mentioned before, I think everything we spoke about today is canon, but it's important to remember where the information comes from in order to use it properly in your own understanding of the canon as you read the source material for yourself. But let me know what you think of all this, both all the things we talked about today and the source itself, whether or not you think it's canon or not, and what bits of lore you've read that either contradict something here or reinforce it. I'm actually pretty curious myself about the Emperor's Anchor. Now we know he stays connected to the physical universe so he can keep the Astronomicon going, but I wonder if him being anchored gives him some type of leg up against the Chaos Gods, since spirits struggle to detect or interact with anchored souls. Also, I would leave a link to this document in the description, but I don't know what the legality of that is considering it was a leak in the first place and it was never meant to be released. But if you just Google the exact same title of it, it's not that hard to find. Anyways, as always, leave all your questions, comments, concerns, and ideas for future videos down in the comment section below. Big thanks to everyone who supports all the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.